You just teach flight simulators." My dad said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. My face went hot. The smile I'd kept all evening locked into place. He had tapped his glass like he was calling the room to order, and then he'd said it out loud. At a charity dinner for veteran scholarships, in front of people who'd given thousands to help students like the ones I used to be. People who understood what service actually meant, who'd written checks to fund scholarships for young people trying to find their way into meaningful work. And Dad had turned me into a punchline in front of all of them. I watched Grant set down his wine glass. Slowly. His jaw was tight, and he wouldn't look at Dad. The tablecloth had a dark stain spreading across the white linen where the wine had gone everywhere, splattered across the fabric, pooling near the centerpiece. The band kept playing in the corner, something smooth and forgettable, but our table had gone completely silent. The conversations around us kept going, but the people nearest us had stopped mid-sentence. You could feel the air shift. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stand up and correct him, to tell everyone in the room exactly what I actually did and watch Dad shrink under the truth. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole, so I wouldn't have to sit there with everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see what I'd do next. Instead, I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and my face burning, because this was supposed to be a nice night and I didn't want to make a scene. I'd come because Dad had asked me to, because Mom had said it would mean a lot to him, because I thought maybe we could just get through one evening without incident. But it was already a scene. And the question hanging in the air wasn't whether people had heard him. It was what happened next. Whether I'd laugh it off. Whether I'd defend myself. Whether Grant, who'd gone completely still beside me, would let it stand. I wish I could say it began there, but it started years earlier. I grew up in a town that kept ledgers. Not the kind you balance at the end of the month, but the kind people carry in their heads: who matters, who doesn't, who's worth listening to, who gets laughed at. Every conversation at the post office or the diner or the church parking lot added another entry. Status wasn't about money exactly, though that helped. It was about who controlled the narrative, who got to tell the stories, who had the room's attention when they spoke. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, which meant privacy was mostly theoretical. What you did on Saturday became Sunday's gossip. How you raised your kids became everyone's business. Who you voted for, what you drove, where you shopped, what you wore to church. All of it went into the ledger. And once something was in the ledger, it stayed there. You could spend years trying to change how people saw you, but that first entry tended to stick. Dad understood those ledgers better than anyone. He knew how to work a room, how to make people lean in and laugh, how to position himself at the center of every story he told. He could take the smallest incident, someone forgetting their wallet at the gas station, a kid mispronouncing a word in Sunday school, a woman tripping on the church steps, and turn it into entertainment. And people loved him for it. He was the guy everyone wanted at their barbecue, their fundraiser, their Sunday dinner. The life of the party. The one who kept things interesting. But what made him so good at entertaining people also made him dangerous to be around if you were on the wrong side of his attention. Because he knew exactly where to press to get a reaction. He knew which insecurities people carried and which topics would make them flinch, and he used that knowledge constantly, not out of malice necessarily, but out of a need to maintain control of the room. And he knew how to use humor like a tool, sharp and precise. He'd find the softest part of you and press just hard enough to make you flinch, and then he'd smile and wait for everyone else to laugh with him. The genius of it was that if you objected, you became the problem. You were too sensitive. You couldn't take a joke. You were making things awkward when everyone else was having a good time. Mom called it toughening people up. She'd say it quietly, like she was explaining something to herself as much as to me. Like if she could frame it as character building, it would hurt less. Dad called it keeping things light. He'd wave off any objection with a dismissive hand and say people these days were too sensitive. that he was just joking around, that if you couldn't take a little ribbing, you wouldn't survive the real world. I learned early that it wasn't light if you were the one bleeding afterward, that what felt like lightness to the audience felt like a knife to the person on the receiving end, and that no amount of explaining that would change how people saw it, because they hadn't felt what I'd felt. The church parking lot was the worst. Sunday mornings, after the service, people would stand around talking in little clusters near their cars. The sun would be bright and everyone would be smiling, still in that post-sermon glow where everyone was supposed to be at their best, showing their best selves. And Dad would see me walking toward the car, and he'd call out something about my posture, my hair, the way I was carrying my Bible, the shoes I'd chosen that morning, the speed at which I was walking. One Sunday he commented that I looked like I was trying to sneak out of church. Another time he said I looked like I'd gotten dressed in the dark. Once he asked if I was training for a marathon because I was walking so fast, implying I couldn't wait to leave. Another time he said I moved like I had somewhere better to be, like church was beneath me. Something small enough to sound like a joke, but sharp enough that I felt it land. Sharp enough that I spent the drive home replaying it and wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I did look ridiculous. Maybe everyone had been thinking the same thing and he was just brave enough to say it. People would laugh, not mean laughter exactly, not the kind that says we hate you or we want you to suffer. Just the kind of laughter you give when someone's being funny and you don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. The kind that goes along to get along. The kind that says I'm part of the group that finds this amusing, without stopping to think about what it costs the person being laughed at. Mom would touch my shoulder and say something quiet, trying to deflect, asking Dad if he'd seen where she'd left her keys, or mentioning something about lunch plans, or commenting on the sermon. But Dad would keep going until the laugh landed the way he wanted, until he'd gotten the reaction that confirmed he was still the center of attention, still in control of the moment, still the most interesting person in the parking lot. I learned to time my exits. I'd wait until Dad was deep in conversation with someone else and then slip out quietly, hoping to make it to the car before he noticed. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the comment would be about how I was always trying to avoid him, or how I thought I was too good for family time, or how I'd rather be alone than spend 5 minutes with people who loved me. I learned that being seen meant being a target. So I got good at being useful without being noticed. I cleaned the kitchen before anyone asked. I helped set up for church events, carrying folding chairs and arranging tables, working quietly in the background while other people socialized. I ran errands without being asked. I became the kind of person people relied on but didn't really look at. The kind of person who got thanked in passing but never really known. People would say I was such a helpful girl, so quiet, so responsible. They'd say it like it was a compliment, not understanding that I'd learned to be those things because being anything else, being loud, being present, being visible, meant becoming Dad's material. Invisible felt safer than performing. Performing meant risking Dad's attention, and Dad's attention always had teeth. High school offered a different kind of invisibility. I ran cross country. Not because I loved it, not because I was particularly fast, but because it was steady work with clear measurements and no audience except a timer and a finish line. I liked knowing that effort translated directly into results. No one had to narrate my performance or interpret whether I'd done well. The clock did it for me. 3 miles in 22 minutes meant something specific and inarguable. There was honesty in that. The team was small and quiet. We practiced after school, running loops through neighborhoods and trails, and then we'd go home. No one made speeches about what it all meant. No one turned our workouts into life lessons or demanded that we perform gratitude for the opportunity. We just ran, and the work itself was enough. A guidance counselor noticed. I don't know what she saw exactly, but she pulled me aside one afternoon in late junior year and asked what I planned to do after graduation. I didn't have a good answer. I'd been focused on getting through each day without incident. not on building toward anything specific. She asked what I was good at. I said I didn't know. She asked what I liked. I said I liked things that had clear rules and clear outcomes, things where effort mattered more than charm. She nodded like that made sense. Then she said I seemed like someone who did well with structure and pressure, someone who could handle organized chaos without falling apart. She mentioned emergency medicine. She mentioned military service. She said they were programs that valued focus and stubbornness, programs that would train me and use me and not care whether I smiled enough or said the right things at parties. I went home that night and didn't say anything. I sat with the idea for days, turning it over, testing it against what I knew about myself. It felt possible. It felt like a door I could actually walk through. At dinner a few days later, I mentioned it casually, just testing the temperature. I said I'd been thinking about medical training, maybe through a service path. Dad laughed. Not a small chuckle, a full dismissive laugh. He said I'd quit the first time things got hard, that I didn't have the spine for real work, that I'd spent my whole life looking for the easy way through, and this wouldn't be any different. Mom went quiet. She looked down at her plate and didn't say anything because saying something would have started a fight, and she was tired. She was always tired. I signed the papers on my own time. I kept the copies in a binder I hid in my closet, tucked behind old school notebooks and yearbooks. I didn't talk about it again until it was done. By the time Dad found out, the decision was already locked in and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Training replaced Dad's voice with protocols, checklists, and pressure. The work was hard in ways I'd been told I couldn't handle, and I handled it. Every skill I learned came with a standard I had to meet, and meeting it meant I could move forward. No one cared if I looked confident or sounded smooth when I answered questions. They cared if I could do the job when it mattered. They cared if I could keep my hands steady when someone was bleeding out in front of me. They cared if I could make decisions under pressure and live with the consequences. The instructors were blunt. They didn't soften criticism or worry about hurting feelings. If you made a mistake, they told you. If you fixed it, you moved on. If you didn't, you repeated the training until you got it right. There was no ambiguity, no hidden agenda, no performance required beyond competence. No one cared if you smiled while you worked or if you had the right personality for the job. They cared if you could keep someone alive when everything was falling apart. I thrived in that environment, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. The standards didn't shift based on who was watching or what kind of mood someone was in. You either met them or you didn't. You could see your progress in concrete terms, skills mastered, certifications earned, scenarios passed. No one could take that away from you or reinterpret it to mean something else. For the first time in my life, I had evidence that I was good at something, not good enough despite your flaws, or better than we expected given your limitations. Just good, competent. Trusted with real responsibility because I'd proven I could handle it. The word changed how I saw myself. I'd spent so long believing Dad's version of me, too soft, too sensitive, likely to quit when things got hard, that I'd started to think maybe he was right. Maybe I was performing strength and eventually the performance would crack and everyone would see that I'd been pretending all along. But in training, there was no room for pretending. The work was too demanding, too technical, too high stakes. You couldn't fake your way through a trauma scenario. You couldn't charm your way past the skills assessment. You either knew how to do it or you didn't. And if you didn't, you learned because lives would depend on it later. I kept the details to myself, partly because operational security mattered. There were things I genuinely couldn't talk about, protocols I had to follow, lines I couldn't cross even with family. But partly because I was building something Dad couldn't turn into a punchline, and I wanted to keep it that way. If he didn't know the specifics, he couldn't reduce them. He couldn't take what I was doing and reshape it into something smaller and easier to laugh at. He couldn't turn years of training and sacrifice into a setup for his next joke. I'd watched him do it to other people. Someone would share a real accomplishment, a promotion at work, a degree earned, a personal milestone, and Dad would find the angle that made it funny. He'd congratulate them, and then immediately undercut it with a comment about how long it took them, or how surprised he was they'd managed it, or how it wasn't as impressive as what someone else had done. And the person would laugh along, because what else could they do? But you could see it land. You could see the moment their pride deflated just a little. I wasn't going to let him do that to me, not with this. At family holidays, I showed up tired and vague. I'd drive in late on Christmas Eve or Thanksgiving morning, stay for a day or two, and leave as soon as it was socially acceptable. When people asked what I did, I said I worked in medicine and left it there. If they pushed, I'd pivot to something else, ask about their kids, their job, the weather, anything to keep the conversation from landing on me and staying there. It wasn't that I was ashamed of the work. I was proud of it, more proud than I'd been of anything in my life. But I'd learned that sharing anything real with Dad meant handing him ammunition, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Better to keep it vague and disappointing than to give him something he could weaponize. During one of Mom's hospital stays, a minor surgery, nothing serious, but enough to require an overnight. Dad and I ended up in the waiting room together. A nurse came by to check on us and asked what I did for work. It was a casual question, the kind of small talk people make to fill silence. Before I could answer, Dad jumped in. He said, I taught people things, flight simulators maybe, something technical, but not frontline, something safe and contained. The nurse nodded politely and moved on, and I didn't correct him because I was too tired to fight and Mom needed rest more than I needed to be right. Later, an older veteran in the waiting room overheard part of the conversation. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner reading a magazine, but when Dad said flight simulators, the veteran looked up. He didn't say anything right away, just watched me for a moment. Then, as he was leaving, he caught my eye and gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that said he knew what the work actually cost, even if no one else in the room did. The kind of nod that said he saw me, and that was enough. I didn't talk about my call sign at home. I didn't talk about it much anywhere, really. Call signs aren't something you choose for aesthetics or because they sound cool. They're not handles you pick out of a catalog or nicknames you give yourself. They're earned, and they carry weight. They're shorthand for a specific set of skills, a specific role, a specific trust that's been built over time and tested under pressure. Mine came during work I can't fully describe, in conditions most people don't see and wouldn't want to. Long hours in places where the margin for error was non-existent. Thin communications where every word had to count because bandwidth was limited and time was short. Pressure rising in real time, the kind that makes your hands shake if you let it, the kind that requires you to lock everything else out and focus on the single task in front of you. People depending on my voice, my decisions, my hands. The work itself isn't glamorous, it's mostly waiting and preparation, systems checks and contingency planning, going over protocols until they're automatic. And then when things go wrong, it's controlled chaos. It's managing fear, yours and everyone else's, while you do the work that needs doing. It's making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences. It's knowing that if you freeze or second-guess yourself, someone dies. The team came out alive. That was the only metric that mattered. The name got said later during a debrief offhand, not as applause. Someone mentioned it in passing, and it stuck. I didn't repeat it for attention or put it on a business card or bring it up at parties. I went back to work. That's what you do. You don't perform the job. You do the job. And if you've done it well, the people who need to know will know, and that's enough. So when Dad said it out loud at the Hastings Club charity dinner, in front of donors and strangers and people I respected, it felt like he'd reached into something private and sacred and dragged it into the light just to make a joke, like he'd taken something that meant everything to the people who'd been there and turned it into entertainment for people who had no idea what they were hearing. But before we get to what happened after the dinner, I need to go back to what happened during it, because the moment Dad said, "You just teach flight simulators," things moved fast. Grant didn't just spit his wine. He set the glass down hard enough that it made a sound. People at the next table looked over. His face had gone completely still, the kind of still that says someone's working very hard to stay calm. Dad kept talking. He was on a roll now, feeding off the nervous energy in the room. He asked me about the call sign. Where did it come from? Was it something I made up? Did they hand those out at graduation now? He was fishing for another laugh, trying to turn the whole thing into a bit he could ride for the rest of the evening. Grant set down his napkin, slowly, deliberately. Then he said, very quietly, that the call sign wasn't a dinner joke. Dad started to wave him off, but Grant kept talking. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel in it. He told Dad, not asked, told, that I hadn't been just teaching anything, that I was the medic on the line when his team needed it, that I'd helped get people home who wouldn't have made it otherwise. Dad tried to dismiss it. He said Grant was being dramatic, that it couldn't have been that serious. Grant said it was accurate, and then he said one more word, enough. The table went silent. Not the awkward silence from before, but a different kind. The kind where people realize they've just witnessed something shift, where the person who'd been controlling the room suddenly isn't anymore. I looked at Dad and said, very quietly, please stop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or defend myself or try to explain. I just asked him to stop. And then I waited to see if he would. He stared at Grant, then at me. His mouth opened like he was going to say something else, but nothing came out. The wine stain on the tablecloth was dark and spreading, and everyone could see it. The concrete proof that this wasn't just talk, that something had actually broken. I prayed silently for self-control, for the ability to hold my face steady and not let the room see how badly I wanted to scream or cry or walk out. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I raised my glass. I looked around the table and said I wanted to toast the scholarship students. The ones who were getting funding this year, the ones who were starting their paths, the ones who were about to learn what service actually costs and what it gives back. People stood. Glasses clinked. The tension broke just enough for the room to find its footing again. The band picked up the tempo. Conversations resumed. People turned back to their neighbors and started talking about safer things. Dad stayed seated. He stared at the wine stain and then looked at me. He asked very quietly, since when? He meant the call sign. Since when had I been night sentinel? Since when had I been someone who mattered enough to have a name that meant something? I said I wasn't answering that here, not in public, not in front of people who didn't need to know, not for his entertainment. He started to argue, but I stood up and excused myself to refill my water. When I came back, he was still sitting there, but he'd gone quiet. He stayed for another 20 minutes and then left early, citing an early morning. His chair sat empty for the rest of the dinner, and the absence felt louder than anything he'd said. The drive home that night was quiet. My phone buzzed once. A missed call, no message. I didn't pick it up. By morning, the story had moved through town. I don't know who told who first, but small towns work fast. Someone at the dinner had talked to someone else, and that person had talked to 3 more people, and by Sunday morning, half the town knew that something had happened at the Hastings Club charity event. They didn't know all the details, but they knew enough. They knew Dad had said something. They knew Grant had responded. They knew I'd held my ground. I avoided checking my messages. I had 17 texts and didn't want to read any of them. I went to the post office to mail something, and the clerk called me, "Ma'am," instead of using my first name the way she usually did. It was subtle, but it was there. At the hardware store, a guy I'd known since middle school gave me a quiet nod and didn't ask questions. He didn't make small talk or fish for details. He just acknowledged me and moved on. At church that Sunday, people's eyes slid away when I walked in. Not in the old way, where they were looking away because they were embarrassed for me. In a new way, like they weren't sure what to say, so they were giving me space instead of filling it with noise. The shift was small but real respect. Arriving late, but arriving. Dad texted mid-morning. 3 words. We need to talk. I looked at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it and block his number and never speak to him again. Part of me wanted to call him immediately and unload everything I'd been holding back for years. But I did neither. I waited until later. I wasn't going to react on his timeline. I had work to do, errands to run, a life that didn't revolve around managing his feelings. When I finally decided to go, it was late afternoon, almost evening. I drove to his shop at dusk. The light was starting to fade, and I could see him through the window, sitting at his workbench with a pencil and a ledger, the radio playing low in the background. In the car, I prayed for a calm mouth and steady hands. I prayed for the ability to say what needed saying, without losing control, without letting anger take over and turn me into someone I didn't want to be. And then I walked in anyway. The shop smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Dad looked up when I came through the door. He didn't smile. He set the pencil down carefully, like he'd been expecting me and had been rehearsing what to say. He started with, "It was a joke." Just that, no preamble, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Just a defensive opening that framed the whole thing as my overreaction. I said, jokes aren't jokes when the target bleeds. He sat back in his chair and said I was being dramatic, that I'd always been too sensitive, too quick to take things personally, that if I couldn't handle a little ribbing, how did I handle real pressure at work? I told him he didn't get to use my work as evidence in an argument he'd started, that he had no idea what I handled or how I handled it because he'd never asked. He'd never once asked me a real question about what I did or why it mattered or what it cost me. He said that wasn't fair, that I'd never told him anything. I said he'd never asked, and that he'd actively shut down conversations whenever they got close to the truth, because the truth was harder to laugh at than the version he'd made up. He got defensive. He said he'd always been proud of me, that he bragged about me to people. I asked him when he'd ever said he was proud of me without a qualifier, without a but attached to it, without immediately pivoting to a joke or a criticism or a comment about how I could have done it better or differently. He didn't have an answer. The silence stretched out. The radio played something old and tinny in the background. Dad stared at his hands. I told him I was done performing, that if he wanted to be in my life, the humiliation stopped here. No more jokes at my expense. No more minimizing what I do. No more turning me into a story for his audience. If he couldn't manage that, I'd walk and he wouldn't see me again. He asked what I wanted from him, like I was making unreasonable demands, like asking for basic respect was some kind of burden. I said I wanted him to stop talking and start listening, to ask questions instead of assuming answers, to let me be a person instead of a punchline, to treat me like someone he actually knew instead of someone he'd invented for his own convenience. He didn't apologize right then, but he didn't argue either. He sat there for a long time staring at the wine stain on his shirt cuff from the dinner. The stain had dried into a dark rust color, permanent. Finally, he said he'd try. I said trying wasn't enough, that I'd heard "I'll try" before, and it had never meant anything, that the apology I needed wasn't words, it was behavior. It was him actually changing how he treated me consistently over time without me having to ask for it every single day. He asked what that looked like. I said he'd know it when he was doing it, and that if he slid back into the old patterns, I'd leave. No warnings, no second chances, just gone. I left before the conversation could loop back into excuses or justifications or him trying to reframe the whole thing as a misunderstanding. The next few weeks were strange. Dad didn't call as often, and when he did, the conversations were shorter. Careful, he asked small questions. How was work? Was I sleeping enough? Did I need anything? The questions felt like he was testing new ground, trying to figure out how to talk to me without defaulting to the old scripts. without making everything into a performance or a punchline. The first few times he called, I almost didn't answer. I'd see his name on the screen and my stomach would tighten, bracing for whatever he was about to say. But when I did pick up, he didn't launch into stories or demand explanations or try to revisit the confrontation. He just asked how I was doing. And when I gave short answers, he didn't push. He let the silence sit. It was uncomfortable at first. We'd never had comfortable silences. Our conversations had always been either him performing or me deflecting. This new dynamic where neither of us was performing and we were just existing in the same conversation felt foreign. At church, he stood beside me instead of in front of me. He didn't position himself between me and other people. He didn't use my presence as a conversation starter or a way to boost his own standing. When someone asked him about my work, he said he didn't know the details, and he said it without making it a joke about how secretive I was or how I never told him anything. He just stated it as fact and then redirected the conversation to something else. I kept waiting for him to slip, to make a comment, to grab for control, to turn me into a story again. I watched him at family dinners and church events and random encounters at the grocery store, waiting for the moment when the old dad would resurface and I'd have to make good on my threat to leave. He didn't, or rather, he started to and then stopped himself. I saw it happen multiple times. Someone would ask about me and I'd see his face shift into performance mode. His eyes would get that glint that meant he was about to say something clever. His posture would change, and then he'd catch himself. He'd pause, he'd look at me, and then he'd say something simple and true instead of something entertaining. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes he'd get halfway through a joke before realizing what he was doing and trailing off awkwardly. Sometimes he'd make a comment and then immediately apologize. Sometimes he'd default to silence because he genuinely didn't know what to say without the old scripts to fall back on. But he was trying, and more importantly, the trying was visible. It wasn't hidden or performed. It was real and awkward and imperfect, which somehow made it more trustworthy than if he'd suddenly transformed into the perfect father overnight. One afternoon in late May, he called and asked if I'd come to a Memorial Day event with him, a plaque dedication at the town square. He said he could use the company, not as a prop, not as a punchline, just company. I thought about saying no. It would have been easier, safer, but something in his voice sounded genuine, so I said yes. We stood through the ceremony together. It was a small event, maybe 40 people, mostly veterans and their families. The mayor gave a short speech. A local pastor said a prayer. Someone played taps on a trumpet, and the sound carried across the square and faded into the trees. Dad stayed beside me the whole time. He didn't try to narrate my presence to anyone, didn't introduce me as his daughter who did important work, or explain what I did, or turn me into an object lesson for the people around us. He just stood there, quiet, his hands in his pockets. Afterward, we went to get coffee. We sat in a booth at the diner and talked about ordinary things. The weather. A project he was working on in his shop. A book I'd been reading. The quiet felt neutral instead of hostile, like we were two people who happened to know each other, having a conversation that didn't require performance or defense. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and said he'd spent most of his life being mean because it was easier than being honest, that he'd use humor as a weapon because it gave him control, and control felt safer than vulnerability. I repeated what I'd said before. That behavior was the apology that counted, that I didn't need him to explain why he'd done what he'd done. I needed him to stop doing it. He nodded and went back to his coffee. A few weeks later, Dad asked if he could see what I did. Not the details, he clarified immediately. Not the classified stuff or the things I couldn't talk about, just the shape of it. He wanted to understand what my days looked like, what the work actually involved, what the training had prepared me for. I thought about it for a while. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep that part of my life completely separate and protected. But another part of me thought that maybe if he saw it, really saw it, even in a limited way, he'd understand why his jokes had landed so hard. Why just teaching flight simulators wasn't just wrong, it was insulting in a way that cut deep. I prayed for peace and clarity, for the wisdom to know what I could share and what I needed to keep private. And then I said yes, with conditions. I told him I'd show him what I was allowed to show him, and he had to respect the boundaries. No questions about things I couldn't answer, no pushing for details, no turning it into a story later. He agreed. I brought him to the base on a weekday afternoon. We went through security, and I watched him sign in and clip on a visitor badge. He moved carefully, quietly, like he understood he was entering a space that didn't belong to him. We walked through hallways that smelled like institutional cleaner and old coffee. People passed us in uniform, nodding briefly, and Dad nodded back without speaking. The training briefing was in a small room with fluorescent lights and a projector. An instructor walked through the basics. What the scenario simulated, what skills were being tested, what the standards were. Dad listened without interrupting. He didn't make jokes or comments, he just took it in. Then we went to the simulator. It was designed to replicate high-stress medical scenarios in austere environments. Limited light, time pressure, incomplete information, multiple casualties, radio chatter creating background noise, and additional cognitive load. The kind of thing that looks manageable on paper and feels completely different when you're in it. I told Dad he could observe or participate in a simplified version. He chose to participate. The scenario started simple and escalated quickly. Simulated casualties with injuries that required rapid assessment and prioritization. Resources running low. Communications breaking down. The instructor adding complications through the speakers. Weather deteriorating. Evacuation timeline compressed. Additional casualties incoming. I watched Dad grip the armrests of his chair. His breathing got shallow. His face went pale. When the scenario ended, he sat there for a moment, not moving, staring at the screen. Finally, he said it was nothing like he thought. I said most things aren't. That the distance between what people imagine and what actually happens is usually pretty wide, and most people never have to close that gap. He asked how I did this regularly, how I functioned under that kind of pressure without falling apart. I said, you learn. You train until the responses are automatic. You build systems that work even when you're scared. And you trust the people around you to do the same. On the drive home, we didn't talk much. Dad stared out the window at the passing landscape, fields and trees and the long stretch of highway that connected the base to town. Finally, he said it. Night Sentinel. Not as a joke. Not with the mocking tone from the charity dinner. Just the name, spoken carefully, like he was testing how it felt to say it with respect. Then he immediately added that he wouldn't use it unless I said it was okay, that he understood now that it wasn't his to use, that it belonged to a context he wasn't part of, and he needed my permission before he said it again. I thanked him. It was a small thing, maybe, but it mattered. It meant he'd heard me when I said some things weren't for public consumption, that not everything in my life was material for his stories. He exhaled like he was setting something down, like he'd been carrying the weight of not understanding, and now that he understood, he could finally put it down. A few weeks later, we were at a family dinner. Not the charity event, just a regular Sunday gathering at my aunt's house. Extended family, a few neighbors, the usual crowd. Someone asked me about work. It was a casual question, but there was an edge to it. That half-curious, half-dismissive tone that says they're asking, but they don't really want to hear the answer. They just want to fill the silence. I saw Dad shift in his seat. I saw the old reflex kick in, the urge to jump in, to control the narrative, to say something that would get a laugh and move the conversation along. His mouth opened. He started to speak, and then he stopped. He looked at me. Really looked at me, and then he said simply, "She's a medic." That was it. No elaboration, no story, no punchline, just the truth, stated plainly, and then he dropped it and went back to his meal. The person who'd asked nodded and moved on to a different topic. The moment passed without incident. Afterward, Dad pulled me aside. He asked if he'd done okay. And then he said, and this part mattered, that if he messed up again, he wanted me to tell him. But not in front of everyone. He didn't want to be called out publicly. He wanted the chance to correct himself privately. I agreed. I said I'd tell him if he slipped, but I also restated the consequence. If he went back to cutting me down in public, I'd leave. No second warnings, no negotiations, just gone. He nodded. He understood. The change didn't happen overnight. It happened in 100 small decisions spread out over months. It happened at the hardware store when someone asked Dad about me and he said he was still learning instead of making something up. It happened at church when people who used to make comments just nodded respectfully and moved on. It happened in the diner when the old crowd that used to laugh at Dad's jokes started giving me space instead of treating me like part of the entertainment. People who'd known me my whole life started using my name differently. Not with pity, not with condescension, but with something that looked like respect. Late respect, sure. Respect that should have been there all along, but real nonetheless. Dad started answering questions differently too. When people asked about me, he'd admit he didn't know all the details. That he hadn't asked enough questions over the years. That he was working on being better about that. It wasn't a dramatic confession, it was quiet and honest. And it landed differently than his old performances ever had. At church, the pastor's wife stopped me one Sunday after the service. She said she was glad things had shifted, that she'd always thought Dad was too hard on me, but she hadn't known what to say. I told her I appreciated it, but that I'd needed people to speak up back when it was happening, not just acknowledge it after the fact. She nodded. She understood. I wasn't interested in collecting apologies from bystanders, but I was glad the air was clearing, that people were seeing me differently, that the narrative Dad had built for years was finally being replaced with something closer to the truth. One evening, I found an envelope on my doorstep. No note, no name. Inside were a few candid photos from the charity dinner. Someone had taken them during the toast I'd given, the moment I'd redirected the room away from the wreckage and toward the scholarship students. In one of the photos, I was raising my glass. My face was steady, composed. You couldn't see the turmoil underneath, couldn't see how badly I'd wanted to walk out or scream or break down. You could only see someone who'd chosen to hold the line and redirect the energy towards something that mattered. I kept that photo. I put it on my desk where I'd see it when I worked. Proof of the night the room stopped laughing. Proof that I'd survived it and that I'd done it without becoming someone I didn't recognize. Dad didn't transform into someone unrecognizable. He stayed stubborn and opinionated and rough around the edges. But he started checking himself. He asked questions before filling in the blanks. He stopped treating my life like material for his performance. He learned to sit with silence instead of filling it with noise. One night, months after the charity dinner, Dad walked me to my door after we'd grabbed dinner together. It had been a normal evening. We'd talked about his work, my work, things happening around town. No big revelations, no dramatic moments. Just two people who'd figured out how to have a conversation without one of them bleeding afterward. At the door, he stopped and said, "Be safe." It was something he'd started saying instead of goodbye. A shift from his old sign-offs, which had usually been some version of "don't screw it up" or "try not to embarrass yourself." Then he added something new. "I'm glad you are who you are." Not, "I'm proud of what you do," with the implicit suggestion that my value came from my achievements. Not, "I'm glad you turned out okay," with the suggestion that he'd been worried I wouldn't. Just a simple acknowledgement that who I was as a person, with my boundaries and my choices and my refusal to perform, was enough. After he left, I stood there for a moment. Then I prayed gratitude for a small, real shift, for the fact that we'd made it this far without destroying each other. And I prayed for strength to keep the boundaries tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because reconciliation isn't a one-time event, it's a practice. It's behavior repeated until it becomes pattern. Matthew 5-9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." I'd learned that making peace didn't mean erasing the past or pretending the harm hadn't happened. It meant holding the line until the future looked different. It meant being willing to sit with discomfort and uncertainty while someone learned how to do better, and it meant knowing when to walk away if they didn't. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." And I'd watched Dad practice that more often than not over the months since the dinner. He'd learned to pause before speaking, to check his impulse to make a joke at someone else's expense, to ask himself whether what he was about to say would build or destroy. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And progress, repeated consistently over time, is what changes a relationship. I'm not telling this story to humiliate my dad. I'm telling it to name what changed and what it cost. Because change is expensive. It costs pride. It costs control. It costs the comfortable patterns we've built our lives around. And it costs time, weeks, and months of small, unglamorous decisions that don't make for good stories but add up to something real. The win wasn't getting to humiliate him back. The win was keeping my dignity and demanding that he meet me there. It was refusing to let his version of me replace the truth. It was holding the line until he stopped trying to breach it. If you've ever been the punchline in someone else's story, you know how much it costs to stand up and say, "It stops here." You know what it's like to watch people laugh along because they don't want to be the one who ruins the mood. You know what it's like to go home and replay the moment over and over, wondering if you overreacted, if you should have just let it go, if making a boundary was worth the fallout. It was worth it. And if you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you love, you know how hard it is to hold that line without burning the whole thing down. You know the temptation to either give in or to go nuclear, because holding the middle ground, the place where you stay but you don't bend, requires more strength than either extreme. Words matter. They build or they destroy, and there's not much middle ground. Public words matter even more because they don't just affect the person they're aimed at, they affect everyone who hears them. They create a narrative that other people pick up and carry forward. They shape how a community sees someone, and once that narrative is set, it's hard to change. The choice to stop cutting someone down in front of an audience is the kind of apology that actually rebuilds trust. Not words, not explanations, not promises to do better next time. Just the sustained, daily practice of choosing restraint over performance, of choosing honesty over humor, of choosing to let someone be fully themselves instead of reducing them to a character in your story. My relationship with my dad isn't perfect, it probably never will be. But it's honest now, and it's based on behavior, not performance. He shows up, he asks questions, he respects boundaries, and when he forgets, I remind him. And he adjusts. That's what reconciliation looks like in real life. Not trumpets and fanfare, just two people doing the work, day after day, until the new pattern becomes stronger than the old one. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If something here rang true for you, whether you've been the punchline or the person who had to learn to stop making jokes at someone else's expense, leave a comment. Your experience matters. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, someone who's trying to figure out how to set boundaries with family or how to rebuild a relationship that's been broken by years of small cuts, please share it with them. Sometimes, knowing you're not alone in the struggle is enough to keep going. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Real stories about real people navigating the messy work of staying human while setting boundaries and demanding dignity. I'll see you in the next one.